the sloppy Joe of Philly
Okay.
cheesesteaks.
We're playing Horizon Zero Dawn, and she's like, "What is this about?" Going back to the burger part. Hey, welcome back to Bread and Burgers, everybody. This is actually a random pickle, and just to refresh you guys on it, it's a different platform where Jonas and I propose a topic to one another and talk, a little bit off cuff here. After all, Bread and Burgers is a place where we can share about, our love of burgers and everything life. So, we don't want to shy away from issues or topics that are like integral to life, and this is one of them. So, today we want to address a more serious issue. I think it's important for us to be in conversation, about this, and I'm sure that we see it, everywhere within the United States context and even globally too. But recently, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and finally George Floyd, set off a new wave of protests, right? With many people echoing the slogan "Black Lives Matter," and I think it's an important message to be said, and the protests against systematic racism and violence, really touched just the United States, right? All across from the East Coast to the West, to the Midwest, to the mountains, and just everywhere. So on behalf of Bread and Burgers, I want to just first of all say to our friends, and this term that we use in church, our brothers and sisters, we hear you, we support you, and we are an ally in this together. Um, but at the same time, I think the important part of it is I want to address the issue that's been circulating, and hopefully with Jonas here, we get to have a varying perspective and also just a different voice in seeing what this issue that I'm going to bring up, about. And really, it's the issue of kind of the indifference or some sort of indifferent attitudes that Asian Americans have on the issue of racism, the issue of Black Lives Matter movements like this. There's a bit of, it's not really my problem, indifference, or some Asian Americans tend not to understand the bigger issue at hand. So, I just think that we should have a conversation about it. So we're gonna bring in two different perspectives. I'm just gonna lay it out there first, or with two different viewpoints. Jonas, you have grown up here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
All your life. You were born here and you were raised here for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And so what again we Asian immigrants call second generation, Chinese American, and myself, I'm kind of a 1.5. I was here from, well, I was born in Hong Kong, raised in Hong Kong until I was 8, and then came to America, had schooling here. So I'm kind of like a 1.5 guy. Maybe we have two different perspectives, and we'll just see what this is. But again, the topic is the indifference to racism and the call for justice kind of in the Asian American community. What do you think about that, Jonas?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to reiterate is definitely we are here for those that are hurting. We want to, we pray for them and we want to support them in whatever way we can. And so I think it's a very nuanced subject, and I think the challenge for us is how do we distill out kind of what are some of the core or key ideas that are kind of driving these things forward, and how do we have a conversation about it? I think for me, that's sort of the biggest point is like let's talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
and from at least my perspective, right? The idea of sort of systemic racism, or at least even boiled to like systemic oppression, I think is going to be pretty different. Just because, not just because I was born in the States and I grew up mostly, when people ask me, where am I from? I'll very kind of tongue in cheek say America, and but even that sort of background, right? Like my family being from Taiwan, yeah, there's a little bit of pressure there, but even more so recently, I think I don't have that direct experience, like, or at least that attachment that you do with, say, like Hong Kong, where
Mm-hmm.
it's also very much very very blatant kind of systemic oppression, and that may so I feel at least a further degree of separation
Mm-hmm.
in some sense.
Okay. Yeah, and but I think even in casual conversation that you and I have, we kind of talked about just kind of in general how I noted that amongst maybe some of our friends or even people who are um, have more followers in Instagram or whatnot, who are Asian or Asian American, tend to not have that sensitivity towards this movement, and many of them and would uh, say um, talk about that. Hey, I understand what you're calling for, but all lives matter. Being one of them. Second thing would be about I understand where you're coming from, but I'm not for the looting or the rioting and all that. And a lot of times I have to kind of talk gently with them and say it's not about that. I'm not for the rioting and the violence too, but don't equate the two. We're talking about the movement and the desire for justice, and some bad apples, if you will, that are potentially hijacking the movement. And I think, but I'm seeing a lot of people kind of equate that and not understand truly why our friends in the African American community feels that this is the time and place now to talk about this issue.
Yeah, I think there's a part of it. Again, this is very challenging because there's a lot of issues being conflated here, right? And I think um, a lot of people just don't want to take that sort of time or energy to parse out what those issues are. And if I want to be really reductionist about it, then it's difficult for me to, right, like, okay, black man dies, suddenly hashtag Black Lives Matter show up everywhere, and in kind of conjunction and in some sense under the auspices of kind of hashtag Black Lives Matters, we have these riots and all of that. And I think there's a couple of aspects that, at least from my second generation Asian American kind of upbringing, that I can think of. Like one of them is I mentioned before is distance, right? And I think uh, I'm gonna say something here that probably isn't super popular, but this is just kind of my brain processing through it. I think at the core of like just people, like we're all kind of inherently racist to a greater or lesser degree. And I would define racism as simply just our inability to process ideas or just process a different culture, right? And
That's different
so
different than
the
your
different
own.
from my own, right?
Okay.
My
Yeah.
own kind of paradigm. And so when we are unable to do that, we tend to kind of, and this is just kind of armchair sociology here. I feel like we kind of tend to look towards uh, and take trends from what we do know, right? And
Mm.
for an Asian American, it's a little tougher just simply because um, it depends on kind of your family and your upbringing. And so the typical Asian American, I think, like with their parents, and for me specifically, like a Chinese American with our parents, right? Like you aren't going to associate with a lot of black people,
Mm-hmm.
just because like your parents wouldn't let you, or they would disapprove, right?
And
And
and just
so
to kind of qualify that, you're talking, especially in kind of the X generations, spectrum, definitely more of the maybe, first 1.5 second generation. I mean,
Like,
as the family kind of assimilates to the American culture, I expect that to be different, and usually
right,
it is.
I do, it is, but I think especially, like, I think the closer you are to the Asian part of Asian American, right? Like any kind of these labels,
Mm-hmm.
I think, where you put in blank American, right? And for Caucasians, it's European American or whatever, right? But for, I think, when if we look at these sort of broad categories, like European Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, of those, or even like Latino Americans, right? Of those, at least the two major players in this conversation, European Americans and African Americans, right? White and black, if you want to, the fewer syllables, but they tend to identify more with that American label.
Right.
Whereas I think specifically for Asians, I'm not going to try to speak for Hispanic Americans, but at least for Asians, uh, because we came later in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
but also because maybe we're just closer to that immigrant line. But I found, just in general, even relative to like second, third generation, like Irish versus like a second, third generation Chinese. And I don't know if it's physical appearance or cultural nuance, but we tend to identify more with the Asian part than with the American part.
Mm.
And I think with that, then we pick up uh, unintentionally, just, maybe we're not as blatant and kind of clumsy about it as like our parents, um, or the immigrant generation that, kind of views, uh, non-Asians as just kind of, different, or
Not our
to
kind, if
to
you will.
to an extreme, right? Like there's a sense of, um, I think, to like the Western mind, the thing we need to understand, and I'm going to use specifically like Chinese culture. Um, we both are more, I think the Chinese culture, Chinese people in general, are both more and less homogenous than most people think, right? Like we're less homogenous in the sense that like, there isn't one kind of like unified Chinese sort of like, there's a lot of different flavors of Chinese, right? Like we say, there's a lot of flavors of American.
Mm-hmm.
But unlike America, I think there still is much more of that common culture. Part of it is history, I think, in the sense that America's history is relatively short in, the grand scheme of things. And so I think we tend to pick up, Asian Americans tend to pick up a lot more of those nuances, and I think personally, at least in my anecdotal circles, like the people that I find to be a little more outspoken about these things, tend to be more like Americanized, right? Like there is an ideal of America
Mm-hmm.
that is there and that's important to them, as opposed to sort of, and I don't think people think about this consciously, but maybe more of that sort of, um, like American ideals as a means to an end sort of thing.
Okay. Okay. So maybe to sum up very quickly, on just briefly on what you're talking about is that there is still this distance, between an Asian American and say a white or a Black American in their Americanness, if you will, and maybe part of that is culture, part of that is upbringing, uh, you know, upbringing, family, and then just having that distance makes it harder for them to engage,
Yeah.
if you will. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, yeah. I think to an extent that's true. For myself too. I mean, although you were talking about how more Americanized, the more Americanized you are, the more you would be kind of involved or at least aware of this. I myself, usually go with the label bicultural, And also I'm bilingual, fluently in Cantonese and English too, and
Mm-hmm.
culture that way too.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense it breaks your model, but I understand. Uh, Honestly, just looking at going back to the core issue here, right? As reductionist discussion is that a Black American dies unjustly, and yes, that is the biggest issue, especially connected to Mr. Floyd. That he was unjustly, at least from the video or from the evidence that we can see at the moment here, unjustly have his life taken away from him. But at the same time, you want to look at it not just from a particular incident. Uh, in the intro, we talked about at least three names, if not more, of people who are suffering in this. Um, and I bring this up, I myself, and I bring this up to a lot of my friends as well, and say that for the most part, you and I and the Asian community going out on the streets, you don't feel that tension, that you know that fear of is this it? Is this going to be, am I going to get, have a run in with some type of trouble, maybe with law enforcement, maybe with other communities. Am I going to be hurt or even lose my life today? That inherent fear, that is kind of enrooted in our kind of racism in culture right now. I feel that that's much stronger in a Black American than, say, a Chinese American. And I have a few thoughts about that too, about the Chinese American side of things. But I think that's kind of the general idea.
Yeah, and I think the challenge here is we don't. I think Asian Americans, Chinese Americans generally don't understand it uh, in terms of like kind of the idea of this is an abuse of the system,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I use those words very specifically, simply because from my perspective, right, being maybe a few steps away, my observation is yeah, it's a systemic issue, but what we mean by systemic is that there is an ingrain in people that causes them to abuse the system. I
Mm.
think if we were to really study the system, and again, we haven't done like extensive studies. I'm not a lawyer, but if we believe in, say, like the American system, right? Then the at least the words on the page
Mm.
aren't inherently like racist. They're not saying like, well, black people shouldn't be treated this way, but the anecdotal evidence we're getting back, and the very hard data that we're getting back is, well, this is happening somehow for some reason, and there's a lot of different uh, reasons that come to play at it. But from my perspective, right, in terms of dealing with immigrants who come are would probably not call themselves racist in the way I think, and they understand it to mean like I'm not racist in the way of like you know how maybe modern media explains
Mm-hmm.
racism, but it sort of plays out differently in their actions, right? It's not like a, oh, I think black people are horrible and they should all die sort of thing.
Mm.
But I think for all of us, it plays out a little differently, and so I think in terms of, right, like the issues that we're talking about now, right, is that, well, there are people. The problem with the system is actually the people that are running the system, right? Like there are people in the system that kind of get triggered or are just prone to react in this way that is kind of making the system fail,
Okay.
right? And I that would be kind of the approach that And so how do we fix that is basically like, how do we fix people in some sense, right? Like, how do we make it so that even if this person thinks this, like, this person understands that it's, I shouldn't be doing, this is not the appropriate way to react. And I think with like little things, like we see this all the time with like rearing children, or like, being in education, or something like that.
Hmm.
But how do we extrapolate that out now to a bigger kind of societal level?
Yeah, and so a kind of little bit meta, but kind of going back into a little bit, the territory that we're comfortable with too, kind of addressing the Asian American indifference. I want to, bring up, like, from my perspective, from a first generation or 1.5 generation immigrants. Again, I think it's what you're saying about distance is spot on. That we tend to identify with our non-Western or non-American cultural roots. Everybody comes and having that ideal, either explicitly or implicitly, having that American dream of having that freedom, having that success, of being in America. That kind of underpins the first generation immigrant, and you hear many stories, right? Even in pop culture and media right now, that all the first generation Americans or first generation are so hardworking, and they work around the clock, to provide for their children, provide for just a better life. That kind of that terminology comes out, and because they value that, that above, I can almost say above all else, right? They value that opportunity, but at the same time, it's while being an immigrant myself, you're away from the culture that you came from, and you want to congregate and assimilate, with people that are more like you. So that's why you see, it's not like because we better establish this establishment of Chinatown somewhere. Like, no, that's not the case. I mean, historically, people kind of move together, because relatives, right? You have relations with someone, friends with someone, family, friends, and then you move in the same area, and B, you just want to be around people that are close, to you. And I'll go a step further. In a book that I've been kind of looking at, culture and faith and a few other things, throughout my years, and a book that I had read, by Dr. Russell Yee. He's actually an Oaklandite. Worship on the Way: Exploring Asian North American Christian Experience, and in it, he doesn't talk about it, directly, but in it he talks about how or why Asian American, especially Asian American faith communities, stick together, and it's because it's a shared story. There's a shared story of coming, from their homeland to America, be it escaping persecution, or be it escaping war, or poverty, whatnot, or maybe not. I mean, maybe you're actually very well off, back home. But regardless, you have that story, that shared experience of taking the voyage and starting a new life and new roots together, and that connection point is why Asian Americans tend to congregate together. Like, oh, I see this person intuitively. I know that he has the same story, more or less, as I. So, that's kind of the underpinning why we're so closed off, especially the first and the 1.5 generations. We're so closed off with the rest of, American society, that, you see that reflected. You see that, typically first generation, 1.5 generation don't participate as fully in civic responsibilities, voting, like city councils, what have you, and also in regards to Black Lives Matters, Black Lives Matter, and a few of these things, the call for justice, it's like it's not part of my world, so I don't talk about it.
Yeah, and I think to kind of piggyback off of that, I think there is a fundamental kind of perspective thing, right?
Hmm.
I think Westerners tend to be people of ideals, and I mean that in the sense of like
Broad
there are
stroke here. But
there's
I agree.
specific, like, I'm taking a step back a little, but I think there it's like that in the sense of like there are specific, they're kind of these broader things that matter, right? Like these principles that we're founded on. And I think part of what to me has been a big challenge for these kind of Black Lives Matter and the sort of rhetoric that comes out is that there's a lot of the same people that kind of champion this idea of like more almost moral relativism, and to me that sort of undercuts a lot of some of the arguments. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying, like, it depends on who it's coming from.
Hmm.
Going back to kind of the Asian perspective, I think Asians, at least in my experience, have tended to be a little more pragmatic than principled, right? Like I think they have principles, but the way that they view the world and they operate in it is much more pragmatic, and so the ideal of like a melting pot, or the ideal of kind of America being like the land of the free, where you can make it on your own kind of thing, becomes much more a means to an end than sort of an end of themselves.
Hmm.
Especially like immigrant generation. I don't know if your parents are like this or if you're like this, but like I know from my parents, right? Like yeah, they have U.S. citizenship and all of that, but like that sort of generation, like they wouldn't call themselves American,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so they would not, like, they are, you know, like yeah, this is America is their home, but non-Chinese are still kind of foreigners to them, and
And vice
so
versa, truthfully, right?
right. And it's, yeah, and you aren't going to have that like 100% embrace of the culture. But also what that means is, right, like I think, and this is just, I'm being cynical about, a little more cynical about this generalization, so I'm not saying everyone is like this, but I think there is this tendency of like I'm just here to kind of game the system, and there is a little bit of in some sense lack of compassion, because I failed, I can't see it outside of that, right? And so like I learned how to game the system and you didn't, well, sucks to be you, kind of mentality.
Yeah, I do understand where you're coming from, and for the most part, or at least stereotypically, I would I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's a lot of major issues, kind of culminating into one. But and for me, the reason why it hits home so much recently, but even more so is, as you kind of mentioned it, from me being from Hong Kong, and the civil unrest, and also the injustices that are happening over there too. But although I want to caution and say this: I don't necessarily want to equate, the fight for freedom, or the call for freedom for Hong Kong, and with currently with Black Lives Matter, because I want to acknowledge and address that my Black American brothers and sisters, um, this struggle has been going on since the founding of the United States, right? And of course, even
Hmm.
before that, right?
Hmm.
Before even in the colonial era, back in all the way up to the 1400s, I want to address that this has been a long struggle, and yes, there are inroads, there are progress, if you will, but truthfully, as a societal group, if you come on, 50 years since the civil rights movement, and still systemically, you see across the board, through news media, or even personal experiences, that you're still this guaranteed freedom based on the law is not it is not yet. And I think that frustration makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it's understandable to be frustrated, especially when you feel like you're getting kind of bilked by the system, right? Like this is something that shouldn't be happening. And I think we all agree on that. And, there is an aspect of, I think some people maybe just take a more fatalistic approach to it, right? And I think this kind of goes back to my kind of discussion on how Asians kind of don't really embrace the kind of American idea, right? And a big part of what's not being embraced, right, is this idea of, um, you know, government of the people, right? Power to the people,
Mm.
10th Amendment, right? And I think the failure to embrace that, right? And you mentioned they don't go vote, they don't run for office, those sort of things, is kind of a demonstration like that is still kind of alien to them, right? And so it's not only that they don't exercise those rights, but I think by not exercising those rights, right, they are shirking that responsibility.
Mm.
And that's something I think, to me, right, like is part of that central conversation, regardless of whatever community you want to be a part of, right? Is that understanding that yeah, it is my right to choose, in some sense to choose how I am governed, but it is also that is also a responsibility. And so yeah, there is a part, you see a lot of videos of people saying like, I hope all of you are registered to vote, you should go vote, or contact your representative, and all of that. And why we have those initiatives is because as an American citizen, that is our responsibility, right? Like we want to have this conversation to call out, right, like things aren't working, right, the system is rigged. And I think, for a lot of, the Asian mentality is just kind of like keep your head down, and like it's very reverse Western, right? Like the adage is, right, the squeaky wheel gets the oil,
Mm.
right, or the squeaky wheel gets the kick, right? And depending on how you want to look at it, like Westerners may take a more optimistic view of like you're gonna get something out of it. Squeaky wheel gets the oil, right?
Mm.
Whereas, a pragmatist might be a little more, pessimistic about it, and it's like, I don't want to cause trouble. I'm going to keep my head down because the squeaky wheel is going to get kicked, right? Like we
Mm.
didn't, government can't afford oil to grease the wheel. They're just going to kick it.
Yeah, and so there's again, it goes back to the whole, like, we want to build a better life for our second generation or next generation. There's a kind of a cultural mistrust of government, probably from an Asian or South Asian background, and you just want to kind of keep to yourself, like, above all else, being in your family unit, being close knit, having everybody alive and well, that's good enough, that kind of thing. And so I see that. um, so I think, aside from just talking about this, how do we move forward? Hey everybody, this is John from Bread and Burgers. Well, thank you for tuning in. As you can see, there's just a lot more to talk about on this issue. So we're actually going to have a second part to this episode of Random Pickles. Hope you can tune in. But before that, please like and subscribe to our video, and have a conversation. Just talk to us about it, because it's an important issue that is dear to our hearts, and we just want to hear about it. Whether we're doing a good job, whether we have some blind spots that we need to look at. Just throw us down a comment below, or let us know. Again, like, subscribe, hit the little bell icon, and we will see you in the next video. Bye.